Okay. Sorry, I had to click the got it.
Yeah. Hey everyone, welcome to the A to Z of Sex with me, Dr. Lori Beth Bisbee. I'm a registered psychologist and accredited advanced gender, sex, and relationship diversity therapist, speaker, author, and most latterly resident specialist therapist on Open House, The Great Sex Experiment, second season of which is running on Channel 4, and you can download both seasons to binge watch on all four. We are working our way through the erotic alphabet, one letter at a time. And today, the letter is Q, and Q is for quirky. Joining me to have a fun conversation today, all about quirkiness, is Terry Stewart. She's a 37-year-old Scottish author that's based in Edinburgh, although over her life has lived and worked in Barcelona, Venice, London, Abu Dhabi, and Stockholm. Professionally, she's currently an associate lecturer in history with the Open University. However, in her life, she's been a croupier, waitress, wine advisor, and an RAF reservist intelligence officer. For the past 10 years, she's also been a history and English teacher, although has since moved into further education. She has 4 degrees and is working on her 5th in Latin and classics. She has 7 years of nonfiction writing experience and has written nearly 40 academic history articles for History UK, and these are all available online. The unofficial Terry is a member of the kink community and has been since about 14 years old. She married an RAF officer when she was 24, and they had a non-monogamous marriage, and she ended up being really good friends with his dominatrix. We definitely have to talk about this. Yes. They traveled the world and had endless adventures as part of the kink community. This relationship ended when she was 29 because he cheated, and we'll talk about that as well, because sometimes people don't think that you can cheat when you're non-monogamous.
So true. I know, it drives me nuts.
And she's currently in a married monogamous relationship. It's the BDSM part of the relationship that's important to her, not necessarily the monogamy, non-monogamy. She's a podcaster and writer, and she's currently writing, and so far self-publishing, a series of contemporary upmarket women's fictions. The difference is that the series is entirely based around the kink community. So, welcome to the show. We will talk about this.
Thank you so much. That's one hell of an introduction.
I know you. Well, you are the definition of quirky, so there it is.
Hooray! And I will take it. Thank you.
It's great. Yeah, no, I was in a polyamorous, well, a non-monogamous / polyamorous marriage, and that ended because he cheated. And I always remind people that cheating is about breaking agreements.
Absolutely, that's exactly right. And when I was kind of coming out of that marriage, I was explaining to friends, and a lot of my close friends obviously knew about our sort of what they would have called like an open relationship, but non-monogamous, and some were incredibly confused by the idea that he could have cheated. And even when I explained, like, they were obviously very sweet, and they were, they believed what I was saying, but I could see that they still didn't quite understand.
Yeah, they don't often get it. It's because they think of it as, if you're non-monogamous, that's a free-for-all.
Exactly, and anything goes, and there are no I don't really like the word rules, but yeah, there are no boundaries.
No agreements and no boundaries. Yeah. I mean, exactly. And there are rules. I don't know why people don't like the word rules. There are rules. We make agreements, we make boundaries.
Yeah, you're right, it's true.
And relationships run better when we have agreements.
Yeah, and I think absolutely.
It was said you can modify an agreement. So I never understood the need to cheat, because all you need to do is have a conversation.
Exactly. And it's so simple. That's kind of the irony. And I think that's what kind of drove me, apart from obviously all the hurt and the pain and everything. It's like, that was so baffling to me, where, he could have had the experience that he had absolutely fine. It wouldn't have caused any problems had he been honest about it. And yet he wasn't. So it was really jarring for me to kind of understand, why would you do that? What was the point? And it wasn't like, it was a kink where he maybe got off on the secrecy of it, because it devastated our relationship. It wasn't about that. It was just, the whole thing was incredibly, it just felt really sort of sadly pointless.
Yeah, no, mine lied for 6 months. I mean, he had an actual affair, and And the reason is because he knew I would have said no about that person because the person was crazy. Like
Yeah.
drama bringing, crazy making human being. And I was really clear that I did not want that in my life. And it was like, well, you were lazy. You could have gone and found any one of a number of people that I would have been perfectly happy with you seeing. And I wouldn't have, it would have been none of my business, but you chose
Yeah.
somebody within our local community. You know, my son was at school and it was his best friend's mother.
Oh my God.
And my son was little. And so you chose somebody who was known to be crazy and who, you know, and who then talked about it, this whole thing, the whole time while it was going on. All sorts of people knew, and I didn't know anything because I was the one who was working. So, you know, and it was this huge drama. And when the relationship ended, it was a huge drama, and she was threatening me. And I mean, it was just awful. And that was completely avoidable.
Yeah. Yeah. That, I mean, that must make it even worse.
Completely avoidable. It was like, you know, the reason that's the reason I would have said no, is because that was all predictable. All
Yeah.
you need to do was get up off your ass and look for somebody, which you chose not to do.
Yeah. It must be nice though,
that
knowing you're
was
so
the
much
end of
smarter than
marriage.
he is.
No, that was the end of the marriage. I was like, yeah, that's okay. You know, I'm done.
Yeah.
I don't need, if you can't even be honest about that.
But that's the thing, it completely breaks the trust, doesn't it? And then I think that's, in any relationship, that's the hardest thing to ever come back from. You know, if you
Yeah.
can't trust somebody, then yeah, I mean, you know, how do you repair that? Where do you go from there?
I mean, you can come back from it, but usually takes some pretty significant therapy,
Right.
and some pretty significant motivation.
Aha. Yeah. Well, there you
And
go.
it depends on the level of breaking the trust, you know. I've had other experiences where somebody kind of like didn't keep the spirit of the law, you know, right? They kept like the letter of the
Yes.
law, but not the
Yes.
spirit of the law.
Right.
And that was easier to come back from because it was like, well, you know, come on, you knew this was not okay. You know,
Yes.
but you know, particularly with prolonged lying, I mean, the thing that's problematic, as you say, is the trust, and it's the lying, it's not the other stuff.
No, exactly. I mean, it was similar with the way my relationship ended, because what had happened was he had actually slept with this person 2 years previously, had covered. I happened to be away. I think I was away with a friend in Vienna, and I had knew nothing about it. I would never have found out about it either. You know, nobody knew. It was completely you know, secret. But yet he just one day felt the need to tell me 2 years after the fact, and it just obliterated that 2 years. It was, you know, it was incredibly odd as well. But yeah, we live and learn.
Yes, well, I mean, people are unique and individual, and we know this.
Hell yeah.
So, I mean, you've had some really interesting, varied life experience, which obviously, as an author, I know that the more interesting our lives are, the more interesting often our writing is, because, you know, we've experienced odd things.
Yes, well, here's
Yeah, you know, so I think being part of the kink community is always an interesting statement when people say it, because it sounds like there's one community.
yes. Like there's one place you go and one group of people you meet up with. Yeah,
here they are,
obvious and easy, and yeah.
And I find it so interesting because you know, so I've been kinky since I was 14, 13, whatever, from the beginning of my sexuality. And for me, like you, and I know you heard me say this in the talk, I mean, that's my sexual orientation. So for me, the important bit was the kink. It wasn't the gender.
Yes.
That wasn't the issue. But the kink was always important. If the kink wasn't there, then I have no sexual interest. I might like you an awful lot, but I have no sexual interest.
Yes.
You know? But I didn't actually become part of an out community really in public until, I don't know, I did a little bit in the US before I left, but that wasn't like being part of a community. I became part of a community in the US when I came back to doing more kink in 2008. And I did a little bit in 2004 and 2005, which still sounds like a long time to people, but considering I've been kinky since the late 70s, that's, you know, that's not in the scheme of things. but I wasn't in public. And I think people don't realize there are a lot of people who are not community members, who choose not to be parts of any community, who still incorporate this into their relationships.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And also, like you said, it can very much depend on where you are in the world as well. And what, like you were saying, from the 70s onwards. I mean, I got really involved in the kink community when I moved to England and was near London, because all of a sudden there was a community. Whereas in Scotland, obviously, you've recently moved here, and there is, but it's far less.
It's tiny.
Yeah, it's less visible. It's kind of, and when I was sort of growing up and obviously very much like yourself, always kinky, always knew this, the internet had just sort of come around, but I didn't know how to use it. Like I had no idea how to access any of this. And sort of that came later, and it was going to events and, things like we had, it used to be, I don't even know if it still exists, like Club Noir was like a sort of burlesque event, which was always really fun, but it was very much the sort of, softer end of the scale, and sort of thing people who aren't even kinky would go to because it was beautiful and funny, and I guess like Torture Garden, very, very light. But then when you kind of experience a bit more and you meet people and then you hear of other things, then you start to explore and understand. And yeah, I mean, in London, there's a much wider variety of things. And I've never actually experienced the kink community in America, but I've never really spent any dedicated time there. So,
well, I mean, so it depends on where you are. I identify as leather, and leather is a specific subset. And I've spent a lot of time since 2008 and 9 in the POC leather community. And so again, that's another subset. Of course, there are more people in America, so
yeah.
It's easier to find, I think, places and things and events than it is here. But also because I'm a therapist and a coach as well, I've been hesitant to be too involved in a community in the UK because you're working with people, and so you don't really want to run into your clients at an event where you're playing. But also then there was also, I was doing a lot of court work, and I didn't want to be, one day have somebody turn up in my office for an assessment that, I'd seen in a club a few weeks before, right?
Oh, that would be awkward. Yeah.
It'd be very awkward. And then I took this television show, and even though I've been very out and very public, and they knew who I was when they hired me, there's still a morals clause, which is really interesting.
What does that even look like? What is that?
I don't even know. Well, I mean, so I actually spoke to a lawyer about it before I signed the thing, because it was like, well, they can't really invoke that for things they already knew about you, right?
Well, of course, yeah.
And because they hired you anyway, right? Yeah. And so it's like, but I've chosen to be, but I don't think it would be good for pictures of me to end up in the press.
Right. No, fair enough.
Right. And so but then again, that means that limits what I can do in public.
Yeah, it's true. I find, I was a teacher for 10 years in secondary schools. And so you cannot be public about anything. And even though, it's all adult for a start, it's all consensual, there shouldn't ever be the opportunity of it's every teacher's worst nightmare to like run into a student at, like, for example, a fetish event or something like that. But it shouldn't happen because they're underage. And I can happily say it never did happen to me, or actually anybody that I know. But it's this idea that it would be the adult that would be punished in this scenario. Like, I have left secondary teaching, so I can talk about this, and it's great. But I just think this kind of idea, because there's a morality clause there as well, and it's just so archaic, and it doesn't really make any sense for what you're asking, because in order to work in these communities, to be a teacher, you need to have passed police checks and all. So you are an upstanding member, like you're fine, you are
right.
safe, you are a safe person. So what you do in your own time with other adults should be nobody else's business. And yet there's this strange thing, and it's a little bit, I don't know, it's like Scottish Puritanism as well. It's that you've got to be whiter than white in some way, or you know, like a pure person, and it's just bonkers, and also just a load of rubbish as well, because we all have our thing, whatever that may be, you know. But yeah, it still irritates me that there's this kind of
It is, and it's really, I mean, and it can be really concerning, but also, I mean, I think things would be fine if people didn't, you know, then decide that they wanted to invite the media in and sell content to the media and things like that. So I'm, you know, the articles that have been coming up in the press about one of the couples that have been on the show, there's like a ton of articles about them recently,
right.
and they're just, the way they're written are so crap. I mean, it's like, yeah, that's really not what happened, and everybody is actually fine, you know.
Yeah.
But it's all this, ooh, you know, ooh, this, you know, and so somebody got in touch with me about, you know, what did I think about that? And, you know, did I feel responsible for, and I said, responsible for what? The couple are still together. They started an OnlyFans page, and they're being sponsored by a big swing company.
Amazing.
You know, it's like,
yeah.
it's like, I'm sorry, but like, I had nothing to do with that, right?
Yeah.
Right. But clearly their foray for the first time on the show didn't damage them, because they've started a whole new life based on this. So
yeah, it's about
you know,
perceptions of things, and also with stuff like the media, it's what's going to get attention, and you know, the more catastrophic something is, or yeah, it's there's, I mean, I think there was, yeah, there's a lot of things on about OnlyFans sort of coming up and being discussed and stuff, and I think it's great discussions to have. But yes, I think the reality can be a lot. Yeah.
I also think it's really funny because, and you know, I had a conversation with somebody recently, and that was upset at the reaction of friends and family to the fact that they're doing OnlyFans, and I was like, okay, well, let's you know, step back and look at what OnlyFans is. You're doing sex work. No, I don't have a problem with sex work.
Neither do I.
You know, it's a judgment-free zone.
Yeah.
But you're doing sex work, and you're doing it in public. And you're wondering why they're upset.
Yeah. It's, yes, there's taking ownership of decisions as well, where it's like, you know, there is probably going to be some sort of fallout. That doesn't mean that's okay, and in an ideal society
No,
there wouldn't be, but
but you have to think these things through, and I find that people don't. It's like, okay, so you want to do this, great. Yep, it would be liberating, great, it would be fun. You'd like to make your whole living like this. Well, very few people do.
well,
We
yeah,
can
quite.
start there. We can start there. Very few people manage to make their whole living like this. Most of the people that I know who make their whole living like that were doing traditional porn already. So they're well known. They had an audience already. Or were cam people. So they had an audience through doing cam work. And then you still have a limited life.
Yeah.
There is a certain point at which if your audience, maybe you can be successful in shifting your audience, maybe, and some people are, but for a lot of people, there's a life, and it has to do with the attributes you're bringing and the condition of your body and all of that. And at that point, you're done. When that bit's done, you're done. And so what are you going to do then? You haven't thought about that. You also haven't thought about what impact what you did might have on what you want to do.
Yeah, it's so true, isn't it? I remember reading a few years back, I think, about Mia Khalifa, and she'd come out of foreign acting, I believe, and, you know, was doing other things, I think sports presenting or trying to, and it was just, you know, it was exponentially more difficult for her because she had been, you know, an adult movie actor, like a porn actress, and just how, you know, kind of unfair it was to be stigmatized with something that, again, you know, she had finished with, and, you know, it was a choice that she had made, and then she had come out and wanted to do something else. And yeah, it was much more difficult.
Yeah, and but of course that's because of prejudice.
100%, exactly.
You know, we know that's because of prejudice. It couldn't be anything else. So it's but I like people to take ownership of their decisions and to really think things through, and to know that we make mistakes. All of us do, every one of us, and you know, and we just have to own the mistake and figure out what it is that we want to do with that.
Yes.
You know? And I think a lot of times people don't actually have the skills to do that.
I think you're absolutely right. Yes, it can be quite a daunting thing for a lot of people to kind of confront that. And like you say, take ownership and kind of accept that this is, you know, where they are and what they're doing. And
what do you want to do now? Like, where
yeah, where do you want to go next? Yeah.
where do you want to go next? Which I always think is interesting. So you have 4 degrees already.
Well, actually, I've just, sorry, just gulping my tea there. I have just finished my 5th.
Okay.
So I just handed in my last assignment, oh God, in June. So I don't know my classification or anything yet, but I know that I have passed. So I have a BA in Latin and Classics as well, which is really
Cool.
exciting.
What else did you get? I'm interested.
Yeah, so I started off studying history at Glasgow University. Love Glasgow. I have to do a shout out to Glasgow. It's one of my favorite places on earth. So I did an MA in history there, and then I stayed on and did an MLit. And then I actually started a PhD that I've never finished. And my dad will be listening to this going, God's sake, could you just finish? And it's like, yes, eventually one day. But when I was doing my PhD, I met my ex-husband. And 3 weeks later, we were engaged. 9 months after that, we were married. And I moved to England, you know, blew up my life. My decision, 100% my decision. And just took a totally different path. And then a few years went by, I ended up in Abu Dhabi where I did a teaching qualification. So I got my postgraduate diploma in teaching, then did a master's in education because I thought, well, why not? So during COVID, I was bored and had time. And so went back to school and did Latin and Classics. So
Okay, what are you going to do with the Latin and Classics?
do you know, it really informs my writing. And I know this sounds hilarious because I'm writing, you know, modern novels about the kink community, but it's amazing how much a grounding of Latin helps with the English language.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have thought.
Neither did I. And then and all of a sudden you see the etymology of so many words, and so many things in Britain are informed by our kind of obsession with the ancient classical world. So, but honestly, I just did it for fun.
That doesn't surprise me. That doesn't surprise me at all. It's just the way things are here. Cool. I was just curious because you know, you don't meet many people who have, let's see how many degrees I've got. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Well, I was going to say you can't be far off exactly, but you did get it. You see that?
Well, and no, and maybe kind of 5 because of the coaching course that I did. So
there you go.
I did the diploma in forensic medicine and science was the last one that I did because I got bored.
God, that must be so interesting.
It was amazing. It was amazing. Cool. It was one of those situations where I've always been a little bit of a detective. So this course came along that was for really designed for legal professionals and doctors to look at forensic medicine and science. And the qualification is the one they use for you to be a forensic medical examiner at police stations and things, right? So if you pass the qualification, it's the course was done but through the Law Society, but it was administered by the Society of Apothecaries.
Oh, wow.
The Society of Apothecaries was the original organization that qualified doctors in the United Kingdom. So that's how that came about. And I don't remember how I found out about this. I just did. And I signed up on the course. And I think I was in like the first class, and Professor Vanessas, who was a forensic pathologist out of University of Glasgow, said to me, you know, you can't take the exam.
Huh. And
I said, pardon? And he said, well, you've got to be either a lawyer or a bar, you know, like a lawyer, a solicitor, or a doctor to get this qualification. And I was like, well, rubbish. Yeah. You know, I've got a PhD. Why couldn't I
know? That's the strangest rule.
Yeah. So I actually petitioned the Society of Apothecaries. And to this day, I believe I am the only non-lawyer or doctor who has that qualification. So they allowed me to do the dissertation and I sat the exam and I passed. And so I have a postgraduate diploma in forensic medicine and science.
That is fabulous.
Apothecaries. was the coolest thing.
I know, amazing.
It was an absolutely cool course. And I'd gone up to University of Glasgow to see autopsies, to watch Professor Vanessa perform autopsies in case people are finding out weird shit about me. Because I'd never seen an autopsy. And so I wanted to see one because we were studying forensic pathology as one of our units.
Of course.
I was like, well, you're describing it and I'm seeing but I've never been to one. So I wanted to go. So he invited me up to come up to Glasgow. And there was a disaster over in Europe around the time. So this was in 1998, 8 or 7, 8. This was in 1998. And so there was like this disaster that happened and there were a lot of bodies. And then maybe it was during one of the wars, but there was body identification going on.
Right.
And so he got called away and didn't get back in time at the beginning of the day. And he was still waiting for a flight from Germany when I arrived, and because he'd been doing body identification.
Oh.
And the medical students were waiting for their lecture on child abuse and they hadn't found anybody to take the lecture.
Oh.
And they were freaking out because they didn't have anybody to take the lecture. And so I was like, what's the lecture about? It's like about child abuse. And I said, well, the physical signs and things like that, I can use the template that, you know, the notes from the course. I don't know anything about that, but I can talk about a lot about psychology and the process and all of that, because that's shit that I do, right?
Yeah.
I'm being an expert witness in court, like day in, day out. And I, you know, worked with kids. And so, you know, and so they were like, we take the lecture.
I love that. Talk about right place, right time. You're like, sure, why not?
So I walked into this lecture hall, like at least 300 students, you know, making lots of noise.
Yeah. Going, who's this? This isn't who we were expecting.
And managed to get them to shut up and listen. I mean, and so I went and took the lecture. People even asked intelligent questions.
Great.
That was that. And they gave me a little honorarium for doing it. And then he came back and I went off and observed autopsies. And he was
That's
like,
an interesting day, isn't it?
yeah, he was like, did you take my lecture? And I was like, yeah. And he just looked at me and shook his head and was like, okay, cool.
I draw the line at anatomizing your body. You can do that.
Yeah, I said I didn't do the, you know, I didn't do the physical stuff. I talked about what was in the notes a little bit, but I spent most of the time on the psychology because that's what I could talk about. And he was like, wow, okay. He said, you know, he was like, you're something. And I was just like, yeah.
I love that. That's so cool.
That's a good way to describe me.
Yeah.
And it was so much fun. So yeah, no, it's just some bizarre thing. It's just because I was bored. I wanted something to do.
It sounds like the pair of us get bored very easily. I always thought of it as a weakness, and I'm now starting to see it as a strength.
I actually don't, you know, I kind of don't get bored easily.
Oh, I do.
I don't when there's something to be gotten out of something. So I'm quite tenacious.
Right.
I don't like, once I'm wound down, I don't like lots of dead time. So I get bored if there's not, but there's never nothing anymore in my life. And so, you know, it's hard to describe it as getting bored. You know, it's like a lot of people who say they get bored easily will move from partner to partner quite quickly. We'll move, right? Always need novelty. I can create novelty. And so, well, any of us can. People don't realize, you know, interest is really just directed attention. So if you focus your attention on something long enough, you'll find it interesting. I used to get people to do this experiment. You do the experiment, it doesn't exist anymore. But you know, we used to go to dentists and doctors and we didn't have mobile phones, so we couldn't access the internet. They'd have magazines in the waiting area.
Oh God, yeah, back in the day.
Yeah, and they were never things you wanted to read, really, right?
No.
But I would say to people, next time you go into one of those areas, find something and focus your attention on it for half an hour and then tell me whether it was interesting or not.
Oh, yeah.
You know, so it's we have a lot more control than we give ourselves credit.
No, I think that's fair. No, with me, it's just as soon as I learn how to do something, I need to go do the next thing and then the next thing. So, but hey, it keeps me busy.
Well, that's important. So you made the move to from nonfiction to fiction. I understand that.
Yeah.
I've done a little bit of that myself, still writing mostly nonfiction, but at least writing stories that are fiction.
Yes.
And first of all, how have you found that transition?
Honestly, just really easy and so much fun. The nonfiction, I love researching things that I'm interested in. So the historical stuff that I was asked to write was always brilliant fun because the topics were just amazing. And like you say, once you delve into something, it was always super interesting. So I absolutely loved that. But it was also, it was writing about something that is a known subject. So, you could write scads and scads, but it's a means to an end. There's sort of an end point. You're covering a topic. Once that topic is covered, you're kind of done. And I'd always wanted to write fiction. I'd always written, I started the same novel, honestly, about 10 times and wrote the same, 2,000 words 10 times. And then eventually, I feel really bad saying this because having written a novel and working on the second one, I know how hard it is. And I know it is such an achievement for anybody who actually does it. But I read 50 Shades of Grey and was like, this is dire. I'm so sorry because I am impressed.
Oh, don't apologize.
No, but I just, as a writer,
self-publishing has its positives and its negatives.
Yeah.
One of them, it does. It's got its positives and its negatives.
Yes. And just, I was so excited because I got it was years ago when it was free on Kindle Unlimited and you get your recommendations. And I was like, great, oh my God, this sounds perfect. How exciting. And I was like, really, the dominant in the relationship has been abused as a child. That's what you're going with. And I just thought this is such.
Well, it was definitely written by somebody who was not kinky.
Yes. And
so there's a thing about writing what you know and about, writers often write about things they don't know about. I mean, that is part of being an author. However, I've written fiction since I was a kid in terms of short stories. I've just never done the novel thing. I suppose my erotic memoir could be considered, but it's not fiction.
Yes, it reads like it's not
parts of it are fiction, but parts of it are not. But I write about things I know, and or things that at least I've been exposed enough to that I can find out more, and I reasonably know. I do not write, for the most part, I do not write about things I don't know anything about. But lots of authors do. They go and they get an idea and they get some characters and they go and they research so that they're speaking, with they've learned something about it. Yes. With 50 Shades, it was clear that this person had no idea how things worked. Yeah. And that was problematic because so many people modeled their kink lives on.
Yeah. And it was heartbreaking for me because here you have a book that got so successful, which is amazing, which was bringing kink like into the mainstream, and it was awful. And I was like, how has this happened? So I finally got my butt in gear and was like, you can do better than this. And so I actually started writing one book and immediately was like, this is at least 4. So I've written the series. Well, I'm writing the rest of the series because I just wanted it. I wanted there to be books out there that's erotica, but it's intelligent erotica, and it includes the kink community in a non-pejorative sort of othering way. It's like,
and there are people who are great. There are authors I refer to all the time, like Cecilia Tan, for example, who's phenomenal, who writes kink and BDSM sci-fi and fantasy.
Amazing. I think you might have mentioned that in your talk, actually.
Oh my God, Cecilia Tan's incredible. One of my favorite stories in the entire world. I mean, she writes full-length novels, but she writes short stories as well. And one of my favorite stories in the whole wide world is called Telepaths Don't Need Safe Words.
Well, I love the premise of that already.
And it is phenomenal. And then she did a whole book based on those characters called The Veldere. And, well worth it. Laura Antonou, who did the Marketplace series. Mm-hmm. They're wonderful. Laura's bright and a great writer. And there's even fan fiction that's been written.
Oh, amazing. Yes.
Short story fan fiction and stuff. But they never got to the place where where they hit mainstream, which is
Yeah.
so, to me, horrible, because they're fiction, but from somebody with a really deep knowledge of
Yeah.
the community, of the BDSM and kink community, of the leather community, of the fetish community. And so no, there really is no place where there's a marketplace where they're trading, right?
Yeah.
But the reality is that all of the bits and roles have real reality. If you're actually in the community, you're like, yeah, I recognize that. And
Yeah.
then the funniest one that she did was she did the Killer Wore Leather, which was based around a leather contest and conference. And
Brilliant.
it's a comedy, and it's
Yeah.
hysterical. And, so it's just, and yet, compared to the author of 50 Shades, like, this person's doesn't make a decent living as a full-time author and has written amazing stuff.
Yep.
And
It's
this
heartbreaking.
person, and I look at it and I'm like, this is, it's a bad romance novel with kink and BDSM thrown in.
That's it, exactly. And if you like to read, trashy romance, you crack on. I love a trashy romance, but it was because of what I think it was trying to do and failing to do, that it almost actually offended me. And I was like, people need better than this. And so many people are frightened of the kink, not the kink community as in individuals, but of kink, and they don't really understand it. And I think if there's something that can kind of bridge that, and books that are kind of, I don't want to use the word normal because I don't mean that, but books that are more mainstream.
Well, it's accessible. I mean, I write erotic short stories, and with the exception in one of my collections, there's 2 stories that are quite accessible for entry kink and BDSM people.
Yeah. Yes.
And the rest of the stories are not accessible because they're edgy.
Yes, there's a couple of yours I really liked in the memoir, the sort of little snippets of erotica you included. But yes, definitely a few that would be definitely not accessible for people who were wanting to dip their toe, shall we say.
Yeah, no, I don't recommend it as something accessible. No. in the book of short stories, like, when people are like, they really want to read this, and I'm like, okay, so if you want to read it, I'm going to tell you which stories to read that are accessible. The rest of them are not accessible. They're intense. Yeah, because they're dealing with intense kinks. They're dealing with edge, right? And I can write things that don't deal with edge kinks. I can write that, like, I think chopping wood is the one that's the most accessible. Right. And I mean, that's a really accessible romantic story with fun stuff in it, with tying up and beating and all of that, but nothing really edgy. And that's great. But I tend to write things that are more edgy because I like them, and so I'm catering to an audience that often doesn't get catered to. So, it's like,
well, that's the other thing. Yeah, absolutely. That's true as well.
Sure that there's something out there, but when people are first starting out, you want to offer them something that's well written and accessible at the same time. And that's not always so easy.
No, exactly.
Not always so easy, because lots of stuff is just not well written.
No, and yeah, a lot of it can be very niche, which is great and fantastic if that's what you're into and stuff, which is wonderful. But again, it's never going to be that mainstream.
But you know what? It's really good to read the things that aren't accessible to see how you react. And I'll tell you where I got that model. There's a guy, God, I'm going to misremember his name. So I'm just about to type in. Here we go. Yes, I was right. There's a guy called James Williams, wrote a book of short stories called But I Know What You Want.
Right.
He's an excellent writer.
Amazing. I'll have to look him up.
His stories are completely challenging.
Right.
And they're meant to be. And so, like, there's one story with a really graphic sexual assault in it that you don't want to be turned on by, but that you're turned on by. It's one of those things. And I like that. And I've had that people say, I remember somebody coming to me after reading the first part of my memoir in tears. And I was like, what's up? I thought they were going to say they were triggered. And I was like, well, go deal with your trigger. Right.
Yeah.
No, but it was somebody I knew, not very well, but they were really upset. And I said, what's up? It was like, well, I didn't really get the division between fantasy and reality. And I found myself turned on by the actual thing you experienced, which was horrible. And I was like, you can stop crying.
Yeah, that's okay.
That's part of the point.
Yeah. And there's
Right.
that, yeah, and you talk
And
about
there's understanding that just because you didn't like this in reality, didn't like it at the time, doesn't mean it's not something you wouldn't have fantasy material about. And
exactly.
that doesn't make you a horrible human. And that, and so I quite like the place where it isn't mainstream, easily accessible, because what you're doing is you're challenging people.
Yeah.
Like it's like work where there's where bias has shown up, and stuff like that. You're actually challenging people to rethink some of their stuff.
Yeah.
And I really like when that's done with kink and fetish and BDSM, because it's not done a lot.
No, it's not. I think, I mean, the original, obviously, there's the Marquis de Sade, of course.
Yes.
And his work, which, people reference all the time, and when they reference it that they haven't read it. It's like, if you had read this.
I mean, yeah, because it's not easy to read. I have read it, and it's not easy to read. It's quite, and Venus and Furs as well, Sasha. Again,
oh yes,
again, not easy to read.
No.
And I mean, even the story of O isn't so easy to read, and Return to the Chateau. But see, this is what I cut my teeth on, because this is all that was available to us.
Me too. I read these when I was young.
Yeah, I was 14.
Yeah. Me too. And parts of the I was trying to remember the name. It's 120 Days of Sodom, isn't it? It's like the
yes.
original. Yeah. Parts of that was horrific to me, but still interesting, and still like enjoyable. But I love the story of O. But yeah, I went back and read that later, actually. And it is there, it's darker than people, I think, expect sometimes.
Yeah, and so there's layers, and so I do think there's, and I do think there's something to be said for reading something outside your kind of normal wank fodder, right? Call it wank fodder because that's what it is, right? For not just picking up the book to read it because it turns you on, and you can fantasize about it, and then you can go and do your thing, but to actually read something that's going to challenge you to reconsider what is the turn on, what actually is the turn on.
Yeah,
because you find yourself not wanting to be turned on, but turned on because the characters are turned on.
Yes, even to like despite yourself.
Right, and then you're like, oh God. Yes. And then you have to actually think about, well, wait a minute.
Yeah,
what is it about that? So I quite like stuff like that.
Yeah, you've just reminded me, it's very funny. So I follow this author on Instagram, and actually I haven't read any of her work, but the stuff she posts is always hilarious in terms of just, the things she says. But she writes very, very dark romance. And she says that, and she has, everything she puts, she will have at least 20 or 30 trigger warnings, and they are absolutely, and she makes a point of some of this is going to be very true for some people, and it's very, very dark. And yet she will then post responses she gets from people who've read her books and hated them, but keep reading them and keep posting about how awful they are and how she's going to hell and she's a sinner and how could you write this? It's so disgusting and sexual abuse isn't funny. And you're like, if you hate it that much, first of all, maybe don't read it. But also, she is telling you what to, like, calm down. It's a book. It's not going to bite you. And it cracks me up, the vitriol that,
I've had somebody did a review of one of mine recently that was lovely, which was like, I like these 3 stories, but I didn't need to read those.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
And I was like, everything isn't for everybody, and it was almost saying, could you have divided it into 2 books? And the answer is no.
No.
Yeah. I'm telling you, you should be exploring to see what it is that by all means explore, right?
Yes.
Most of my stuff is reasonably dark, or edgy, because that's me. Yes. And when you read the memoir, you actually really understand. When you read the memoir, you have a really good understanding of why my erotica looks like it does.
Yes.
But it was really funny when I put that out. That was like, oh God, that was hard. I struggled with that for many years as to how I was going to write this. And it was a book coach that I was working with, the inimitable Meg John Barker, who's the most
Mhm.
incredible book coach on the planet, who said, I think you should write this as an erotic memoir. And I said, what?
Yeah.
What's
Uh-huh.
an erotic memoir? And they said, you put a piece of erotica and then you put the reality. And
Mm.
they said, I think that and then some analysis would actually be really intense and would really it would really add value, and it would really end up giving people a much better view of you and your life, but also a much better view of a way to look at themselves and a way to consider themselves and their own stuff. And because of what I do for a living, that really appealed to me.
Yeah.
And so what I did was I've been collecting stuff for about 15 years, where I'd write snippets and I'd put it away, and I had erotica from the time I was 12. And the stuff from when I was 12 was really funny, but I digress. But I had
Yeah.
all this stuff, and I pulled it all together, and I pulled quotes out all together. And I got set up to write to decide. So I decided kind of roughly what was going to be in the book in terms of the erotica. So that was one stage where I had to actually go through everything and go, okay, I don't know which piece is going to go where, and I don't know if all of them will go in, but this is the pile of stuff I'm going to put in this, and the rest I'm not. And then NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month, which is in November every year, I got set up for NaNoWriMo 2019 that I'd said I was going to write a draft, a full draft. And it was just before I was about going to do that I realized that I hadn't returned to the place of my biggest trauma, that I'd never gone back.
Oh,
And I
wow.
was having trouble writing certain segments, and I thought, fuck it. So I went on a road trip in the October, and I spent 3 weeks revisiting places
Wish.
that were going to be in the book, which was really intense and really cool.
Mm.
And then came back and sat down for NaNoWriMo and wrote the draft from start to finish. And then put it out early 2020, in the middle of the first lockdown.
Yeah. It's really interesting because obviously you write about some quite hard things, and there are some quite hard things, but it's not a hard read, which
I'm a good writer.
yeah, but I mean like it's beautifully written, but I mean like it's not written, or it doesn't read like it's written from the like perspective of trauma. So
It's because it's not.
And it reads like a beautiful story that obviously has some very dark elements, but it's written in a way that draws you in as opposed to repels you out.
Yeah, I mean, ideally I want it to be uplifting. And the reason that I'm able to do that is because I'm not traumatized anymore. And that's a thing, that's also a reason for writing this, which is people believe that when you've been through something like that, that inevitably that means that you're traumatized for the rest of your life.
That's it, yeah.
And it doesn't. There's good therapy. There are good techniques.
Yeah.
And there are good ways of doing the work. And the work is like on multi levels. And I've done the work. It's really interesting because one of the characters and one of the people in the memoir is somebody that Sarah, who's somebody who I had on and off relationship with. And at the time that I was writing this, it was not fully off, but off. I mean, we were kind of barely friends.
Right.
But I met him when I was 21. And one of the main reasons, and I think it comes clear in the book, that we weren't together was because he needed to do his work and didn't do his work. So when I was 21, he was 37. So that's like to keep in mind, it was like 1984. So about 6 months ago, November, December, maybe December. But it wasn't until after the new year that we really talked. So in December, I reached out to him because, so now at that point, I was 59. He's 75.
Oh, gosh.
And I reached out to him because when somebody holds that much of your history, the tie never broke. The tie was always there.
You're still there, yeah.
And I hadn't spoken to him in some time, and I was anxious about how he was, and realized there were things I wanted to say before he died, and that kind of thing. So I reached out, and eventually I heard back. But the tone of the person that wrote back to me was so different than what I was used to that I was quite shocked. And we started
Uh-huh.
texting. And here's this person talking about their feelings who never talked about their feelings ever.
Oh my goodness.
And I discovered that after all those years, he decided to do his work. And so he was like, I know what your setup is, and I'm not going to interfere with that, but I want to know if there's a place for me. And I was just like,
Oh my God.
what?
Yeah.
So after 39 years, we're in a relationship now. And like, it's like, it took 39 years
39 years.
to sort this shit out. I'm like, so we started seeing each other again, and my system works. I mean, he fits really well, and everybody
Nice. Yeah.
everybody's fine, which is
Yeah.
good. But the first time I went to see him, which was in April, we ended up talking about the trauma in my life and the stuff that I experienced and the aftermath, because he was not around for what happened, but he was part of the aftermath. And there were things that he brought up, and in dialogue, things I realized that mean that I have to go back to the memoir, because I want to rejig a piece, want to put a postscript on, because there were things that I never was able to come to terms with or make sense of until we had this conversation.
That's
some
amazing.
some of it I can't put in a book.
Yeah.
But some I don't know when I'll do it, because right now I have stuff on, but I'm like, oh, I now have to go back and rejig some of that. Because I think that one of the best bits is to be able to say, and people can decide to do their work at any age.
Yeah. I love that though, that eventually it happened. Like, oh, that must have been amazing.
Seriously, I mean, I've always thought, when people get into their 60s and beyond, if they haven't worked on it and they're not in the habit of working on themselves, they're probably not going to. So somebody had to show me up, right?
Yeah.
I think it's probably still, you can make that generalization, but I think it's never over till it's over. And
yeah.
And I've learned that. And so when I wrote that, and I still feel this way, I mean, when I write stuff about trauma, I write stuff about the fact that you can come out the other side of it. And I'm realistic about how it impacts relationships. But somebody said to me, does it impact your relationships anymore? And it's like, well, no.
Wow.
It does, in as much as it's part of who I am.
Yes, and it's part of
I don't have trigger warnings. I don't have trigger warnings on me. It's not like, oh my God, if you do the wrong thing, you're going to step on that, and that trauma, like that doesn't get triggered.
And that's fantastic. I mean, that is amazing, considering, some of the things that you talk about, and to know that must be so comforting for so many people.
I completely freaked an audience out the other night, because the way that, the talk changes no matter what I'm doing.
Of course.
And somebody asked a question, and the way they asked a question, I just said, well, I was killed during, my first relationship, my first proper BDSM relationship. The guy killed me in the middle of it, and, then brought me back to life. And no, this was not fun. Yes, this was traumatic. And yes, this did put me off stuff for a while,
Understandably so.
Like the way but it was me. I mean, so it didn't put me off because it was me. What it did was make it more confusing. It didn't actually put me off. It just confused me.
Yeah.
But the way that I said it was so matter of fact that, like, I watched part of the audience for like, you what?
Yeah. Did we hear that right?
Yeah. So somebody said, you don't sound traumatized. And I'm like, well, I'm not anymore.
Yeah.
I was, and sometimes I forget when I talk about it that because I don't talk about it with emotion, that either people think they heard it wrong or don't believe it, or they feel like that's weird, and it's not weird. It's just not traumatic to me anymore. It was the most traumatic incident of my life, and it impacted every part of my being. It changed my career. It changed everything. But it no longer has the power to trigger me.
Yeah.
But what it does do is have the power to get people to think. about the decisions that they make and the ones that they make afterwards and how they want to live their lives. And I decided that I did not want to be a victim for the rest of my life. And that being a survivor wasn't good enough. And that I didn't want my life defined by the negative experiences that I'd had.
Yeah.
And they then did the work to make sure that that's it. And that's why it reads that way, because it's being written from that perspective, from the perspective of somebody. It's being written from somebody who's already on the other side of
It's
it.
come out of it, yeah, and being able to, what is it, you say, reintegrate back into life? It's that you work through it and then you become a survivor, and then you can sort of
Then you go, then I say to people, and thrive or living or, back into life. I use all those terms. So there is, and in fact, my PhD research for my doctoral dissertation for my clinical psychology degree was from victim to survivor and beyond. And I did a treatment outcome study on the stuff that helped me get through. And I compared it to some other stuff. And that was what I did my research on. But it is a mindset change for most people.
I think, well, it's from victim to survivor is quite a common, people understand that and they think about that, but they don't do the next bit. I'd never heard of the next bit until reading your work, and it's like, once you think about it, of course, that's where, you would want to go. Like you say, you don't just want to be a survivor, you want to then continue with your life. I think that's amazing. And
people don't have the tools, and that's part of what I do, is try and help people gain those tools that they need to be able to do that. And it's, people are really resistant sometimes, just like they're resistant to me saying, I give trigger warnings sometimes and I don't at others, because your triggers are yours.
Yeah.
And you're responsible for them. I'm not responsible for them. And back in the old days, and you will understand this because you're a bit older, but not as old as me. So, not Methuselah. But back in the old days, there were no fucking trigger warnings on anything.
No.
Right. And if your trigger got tripped, then you dealt with it.
Yeah.
You didn't go and shout at the person who tripped the trigger unless somebody was doing it deliberately.
Yes, unless it was, vindictive.
It
but
was
no,
malicious.
Yeah.
If you watched a movie and your triggers got tripped, that's your problem. If you read a book and your triggers got tripped, that's your problem. I mean, because we're adults and we need to deal with our triggers.
And we're human, and things will happen to us, and we will have to, sort of own your experiences.
But I need to do a bunch of writing on this, which I haven't done recently, but I need to, is getting people to take better responsibility for things, because the way that I see things going right now is asking the world to adjust to you. And with there people are being given false hope that the world will adjust to them right now.
That's so true. Yes. And
just because the bubble will burst and it will stop adjusting to them.
It's true. And it's more shocking for people who expect accommodations, expect everything else to be worked out around their, perspectives and their experiences. And it's that the world doesn't work that way, and it's a hard fall when that, when that happens. It's like, sorry.
So where can people find Vice, which is the first book?
Yay. It's on Amazon. So it's available either you can buy it in Kindle, sort of ebook content, or there's an actual physical book, because I'm old fashioned. Yes. And it's, a modern kind of upmarket women's fiction, but it's based around the sort of the kink community and BDSM.
And it's delightful. It's delightful. So you can find it there. And if they want to connect with you.
Oh yeah. So I'm on Instagram as Terry Stu Author, but also I've got a website, Terry Stu Author. Basically, Terry Stu Author, you will find me. And I'm delighted to connect to everybody and anybody.
Thank you so much for joining me and having this wide-ranging conversation. It's been brilliant.
No, thank you. I've loved every minute.
Oh, my pleasure. So thanks for listening, guys. And next week, the letter is R. If you want to grab 30 minutes free with me, you have to write a review and enter my monthly contest, because I give away 30 minutes free every month. That is at the moment the only way to grab 30 minutes free with me. So either write a review of the podcast or one of the books, and I will put your name in a bowl and we choose one every month. The other way to get some access to me for not so terribly much money is to consider joining my new private members club. That starts at just under £50 a month and gives you access to a bunch of original content, the opportunity to ask questions in the group, either anonymously or with your name, and get answers throughout the month, and at least one live a month, sometimes with special guests. It is a great way to get significantly more access to me than, for example, purchasing the answer to one question, or hopefully catching me live on Instagram or TikTok or Facebook, because I don't do loads of those, because these days I'm running around the country speaking. So if you're interested, either email me or head over to my website, drloribethbisbee.com. In the show notes, there's also a link so that you can join. If you have something special you want to hear about, do let me know. Email me at loribeth@drloribethbisbee.com. Have a brilliant week and stay safe.